Jennifer Boyer. It's great to be here and chairing this afternoon's panel on high energy users and what the future will look like. In my role as Vice President for Sustainability at TU Dublin, it's quite a new role. It's quite a new role for a university to take on, and I suppose it's fundamentally underpinned by our strategic intent, which extends to the horizon of 2030, aligning with the UN Global Agenda. In my role, I am responsible for building capacity through sustainability education across our students and our staff, and looking across our operational footprint. So we have a multifaceted challenge with over 200,000 square meters of campus buildings, as well as the caretakers for a large set of landscapes across our campuses. I am joined by some really interesting members of industry with me here today, who I'll offer an opportunity to give a short snapshot on your own backgrounds and your roles as part of the conversation. But I suppose in the context of what we'll be talking about, you know, it's about the high energy intensity that we've come to rely on through data centers and cloud computing, the infrastructure of our built environment, and the role that it plays in turning our world into a more sustainable future. So I'll start with Lindsay, and then we'll go to Lorraine, and then Matt. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be here, and a big thanks to Bord na Móna for inviting AWS along to be part of this panel. So I'm Lindsay McQuaid. I'm Director of Energy for AWS. I've been there the grand total of 8 months, which tends to be how things are in AWS because we're growing so fast. But my background is in energy. I've been in energy since 1999. I've worked in nuclear. I've worked in gas. I've worked in risk. But from 2006, I had the pleasure of being part of Scottish Power's renewables business, covering the UK and Ireland, with my last role there being CEO, and talked and went through a number of the changes that John articulated earlier, the shift from onshore to offshore to battery storage to green hydrogen to all of these things. And it's so critical that that's the energy environment that we're all now thinking about. Moving over to Amazon, you know, the use of the cloud. I mean, everyone in this room will have multiple devices in their home. Some of you might have an electric vehicle. Most of you will be consumers of electricity pretty much every waking moment of your lives. But it's really important now where that's coming from. And the data center industry, the cloud sector, has to ensure that as we grow and provide all of the data that we are now using throughout our daily lives, that's coming from sustainable sources as well. So very much part of Amazon's green vision that we've got that at the core of every decision that we're making.
Thank you, Lindsay. Lorraine, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So, Lorraine Fitzgerald, I'm Head of Sustainability at Glenveagh Properties. I suppose I've been in the whole area of environmental science and sustainability for quite a long time, and delighted, I suppose, that it's finally got its moment in the sun. And I've been with Glenveagh for just over a year and a half. Obviously, the built environment is a huge consumer of energy and obviously then producer of greenhouse gas emissions. We in ourselves are not a huge consumer of energy as a company. Only 2% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from direct, sources. But I suppose what's really important is that our impact on the value chain, both upstream and downstream, is where we can really kind of lead the conversation, I think, in terms of the embodied carbon and the energy that's used for all of those building materials that we've been using for, millennia, probably in some cases, the extraction, the production, the logistics, the use of fuel by our subcontractors on site. But really critically, I suppose, the way in which we design houses to use or to more and more not use energy for, the end users. I think those are the kind of the critical things, and we have a great opportunity to kind of lead that and to, I suppose, lead from the front in terms of how we want this space to be.
Thank you. I think we'll get into the direct and indirect Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions through our discussion. Looking forward to it. Matt, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And hello, everyone. My name is Matt Kennedy. So I lead as our Director for Sustainable Development for ARP within Europe. And ARP is the design engineers, as you know them, but I'm going to talk about other disciplines than just engineering. So I've worked for the Irish government, I worked for academia, so I've been involved in this sector for more than 20 years. I really appreciate the invitation and engaging further. Yeah.
Well, let's get started. So I've mapped out a couple of questions to try and cover some of the key challenges that are coming up in the research, are coming up in discussions with our students, and are coming up through recent National Climate Action Plan mandates. Data centers has been, a sectoral piece that's been rising for the last 10 years and increased substantially in Ireland. The debate about how data centers can play a role in society around the issue of sustainability is very much at the core of this. And I suppose recently, Laura Burke, the Director General of the EPA, was talking about the number of applications that are coming through to the EPA in relation to data centers being energy centers as well. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a shift in the role that data centers are playing, which is quite tremendous. And then I think, as an architect, a lot of my own background in research and education would come out of this understanding that the built environment contributes to more than 40% of global emissions through its construction and demolition waste, and that's a huge chunk across the world. Yet we need infrastructure, we need houses, we need to get from A to B. So the role of infrastructure and how we think about that in terms of measurement for good, measurement for human rights and basic needs, I think comes to the forefront. So I suppose in both of these kind of industries that we're talking about, we play a substantial role in contributing to emissions, so that makes the responsibility that much greater upon us in the work that our industries do. So I suppose I'd ask each of you in turn to outline in that frame, what is one of the major challenges that you're facing within your business or your sector? But what do you see as well as one of the major opportunities? And Lindsay, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So I think the major challenge, and you've touched on it in your opening remarks, is the pace with which the cloud computing's taken off and the pace with which we're all reliant on it. We're using it absolutely every single day. And what's become incredibly apparent to me, having come from the generation side of the world into digitalisation, decarbonisation and digitalisation are the two big industrial themes that we have this century. But we need to do that as sustainably as possible, but also as quickly as possible. And the biggest challenge for me right now is the fulcrum between those two. Mm-hmm. The fulcrum is that data centres happen fast. We are growing fast. Unfortunately, energy infrastructure takes time. Yeah. I know the pain of getting planning permission. I know the pain of getting a grid connection. I know the pain of coming down that technology curve when you're looking at offshore wind that was up in the hundreds of euro a megawatt, and it's now, with the success of the last auction, coming all the way down. It's fantastic to see the renewable energy industry responding to that so well, but there's still a timing difference there. And I think when it comes to the sector I'm now part of, we're thinking about how can we square that circle? How can we make it happen? And it is going to be about partnering. It is going to be about us leaning in to those types of technology more, maybe changing our model, and it won't just be a PPA model any longer. Doing things differently. We have to innovate to stay alive. But yeah, that's kind of the biggest challenge. Biggest opportunities around all of that as well. I touched on it, offshore wind, massive opportunity for Ireland. One of my favourite adages since I arrived in Amazon is offshore wind will be the best friends of data centre. They both will complement the continued growth and expansion of the economy within Ireland. They will transform grid operation. They will transform everyone's access to clean energy. And it's a very exciting time to be part of that discussion. It's huge.
Yeah, it is, and that piece around how much supply we'll have and that fulcrum as well of how to balance that demand is also quite interesting. We'll get there in a little while. Lorraine, so one of the biggest challenges that you see in your group, and then also the opportunities.
Yeah, I suppose just the old change in terms of how we decarbonise on a kind of technical basis is a challenge. But actually, I think what one of the big challenges is the data we need to actually facilitate that challenge. And I think that goes back to the fact that a lot of that data needs to come from the supply chain. The supply chain is really complex. Some of our suppliers are really big and they're, able to do that, but a lot of them are a lot smaller. So how do we get all of that data? How do we use that data, to our advantage to try and, decarbonise as fast as possible? And I suppose added to that challenge is, the whole corporate sustainability reporting that's coming down the line for companies. We're a PLC, that is driving a huge amount, but it's actually overwhelming because it's such a big piece of work to undertake to try and bring all that data together and report it. So that's kind of the piece that's if I wasn't a good sleeper, it'd be keeping me awake at night. But it's certainly driving a lot of action, in our company. I suppose in terms of the opportunity is to be innovative and to lead the space and to be able to, design something that actually doesn't require as much energy or doesn't, have the same amount of embodied carbon, to be, at the kind of leading edge, cutting edge of all of that, I think is really exciting and kind of, drives people into action because there's so much opportunity to lead there.
And the prosumer, or the customer as well, in terms of driving that and meeting those needs is quite interesting too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Matt, biggest challenges and opportunity?
Well, I'm going to lead with the opportunity first.
Great, okay? Love it.
So Arup is, you outlined at the very start in terms of the built environment, the amount of emissions that come from buildings and infrastructure. And so there's a responsibility in organisations like Arup to decarbonise. So what does leadership look like? We heard Tom Donlan talking about what leadership looks like in terms of Bord na Móna. What does it mean in terms of Arup? 2 years ago we committed to no longer working in projects that involve the extraction or the transportation of fossil hydrocarbons. That's a €50 million business that we walked away from. So that created a big ripple within the built environment. So that provides an opportunity for us, but it also provides a challenge in terms of changing the business, transitioning into what does the future energy business look like for design engineers then that want more sustainable outcomes. So where we focused attention is we're going to really push the industry to do life cycle carbon assessments. So we committed at the same time that we're going to assess 1,000 of our buildings and in terms of the whole life cycle assessment of carbon. So rather than just make a bold commitment that a lot of organisations do, we went back in November and reported on the findings of those 1,000 projects. So the real focus is on looking at and extracting as much carbon as you can from infrastructure, as much carbon as you can from the built environment, because ultimately the future projects will not get planning. You're talking about a climate agenda that a lot of organisations are trying to deliver to. You may see Arup as being the design engineers, but in my mind, the people I work with are urban designers, they're ecologists, they're landscape architects, they're stakeholder engagement people, or carbon accountants, together with all the engineers. All of these skill sets come together in terms of delivering on a climate project. And that's really where the opportunities are. Policy is driving, the Commission is driving, the Climate Action Plan is driving. But ultimately, there's not a lot of guidance being provided. Clients are struggling to understand in a corporate side what these reporting directives mean. At a government side, how they can make change in terms of delivering on their action plan. That provides opportunity, but it also provides a big challenge within a market in a time when we need to deliver really fast.
Yeah, the learning curve there with the needs being met is definitely at odds. Yeah. I think the role of education in that space and the role of advocacy to bring together standards and methodologies to have a shared approach so that your approach is not dissimilar and unknown to your customers and your clients, and you're operating in the same space as competitors, I think is key to all of this as well. So, in a recent visit with Ireland's Energy Commissioner to the University Executives team at TU Dublin, he was talking about the opportunity around wind and just the position that Ireland has in relation to its opportunities to actually fly the green flag. And for, I suppose, a country of our scale and size and the fundamental inherent qualities of it, really be quite strong in leading on sustainability. But I suppose there is that supply and demand need being met so that, the innovation approach to storing energy or the behavioral piece around individual consumers being prosumers requires a different way of thinking about things than we have previously before through our infrastructure and our systems, and in particular our financial models. So I think, if the aim is to, look at the future and volatility and how we can bring some sort of sustainability or sustainable practice to our businesses, I'm curious to know what role does technology play in this, and what role do people play in this to try and bring us through that balancing of needs and limited resources, ultimately. So, will I start with you, Matt?
Sure. Everyone plays a role. That's the first thing. And even at delivering on a net zero objective, no organization can do it alone. No project will get through any form of success without engagement with the users, be it the citizen or the stakeholders. So the challenge that we have as design engineers in that we want to deliver sustainable outcomes for our clients. So how do you do that in a time? How do you design future projects in a time of a changing climate environment? So if you're designing a bridge right now, the pedestrian bridge was opened in Galway City yesterday or the day before yesterday. Are you designing that for a 1.5 degree world, a 3 degree world, a 5 degree world? How do you ensure that you get the permanency of the infrastructure? Never mind the inputs that go into it. But how do you design a future rail network to consider subsidence that might impact if it's a 4 degree world? So these are real challenges in terms of a design engineer because of climate risk. Now there's other challenges. If you were a corporate or you're an asset owner, you would be very concerned. We heard earlier this morning about stranded assets. How do you understand the nature of your portfolio? How do you, which of these buildings or assets will be devalued based on policy changes? And ultimately, how do you ensure that you're engaging with the consumer, that you're engaging with the stakeholder, so that actually the outcomes that you're delivering are the ones that are appropriate for society and delivering that value? And it's, in my view, I constantly talk to Arup about it's time to look outside the building, not just inside the building. It's time to look at the landscape. It's time to look at the ecology and the architecture and the public realm that happens outside. And how do you ensure that the right places are being designed, that you're building and designing villages and intersections where people want to live, and actually having the person at the center of that design, not the concrete at the center of that design. And these are this is the considerations that corporates now need to make in terms of design engineering and a reaction to future climate change.
And I think you've hit on something there, which is, the human factor in this. It's ultimately change, and it's people having to give things up. And the understanding around what you're giving up in terms of being something of ease or that you've practiced for many years is, I suppose, getting into just that wider openness of discussion. Well, what does unsustainability look like? And if you can describe what unsustainable practices and things are, what is sustainable becomes quite an obvious kind of flow then. So thanks for that, Matt. Lindsay, over to you.
Yeah, I guess building on Matt's comments, it's about how much of this can be done to us passively. How much of this do we actually, the environment around us is going to change, and how much of it, as consumers of energy and of consumers of product, are we going to have to take positive steps? So, I touched earlier on about all the devices we've all got in our households. What's going to happen when somebody comes in and creates an aggregation model to access all of that storage that is in going to be in everybody's home. Mm-hmm. How can that be used to prop up the grid? How can that be used so that we don't have to build another power station if we have to optimise the amount of grid infrastructure investment we've got by tapping into that distributed network that's already out there? How we are all going to engage in that market is going to change. It's not going to be as simple as flicking a switch or charging your iPhone any longer. It's going to be a very different aspect, and your electricity bill is probably going to look different as a result of that as well. But that's at a household level, and I think a sort of, certainly from an AWS level, we're making active steps to make sure that our impacts are mitigated as much as possible. You'll be aware of we've also got a RE 100% goal for 2025. We've publicly announced by 21 we'd achieved 85% of that. Since then, we've confirmed that we've now got over 20 gigawatts of contracted PPA renewable power, almost 200 of them being utility-scale investments dotted around the globe. But that's all about the input to the buildings that we use to power all of that data crunching. But then we look at a much more granular level, and it's about the efficiency of the chips that we're even using. So we're constantly innovating. And the latest generation of chips that we've got are 60% more energy efficient than previous generations. And then if we're also then looking at the use of the cloud versus a conventional self-service model, you're 3.6 more efficient with an 88% CO2 saving. So there's a massive benefit to us coming together to aggregate, to collaborate, to then ensure that it is affordable, that there is value there, and that we're doing it in as sustainable a means as possible. We've got a great example, and Cahill's in the audience here, of energy clouds that hit the press a few months ago. That's where we're seeing underutilised renewable power via a device in collaboration with the energy cloud being used to heat that spare power effectively for water immersion heaters in 1,000 homes. Fantastic to see that happening, rather than energy that can't be stored somewhere and it would just dissipate. And then we've also got a heat recycling scheme in Tala where 47,000 square foot is being used from spare heat because a lot of processing creates some heat, but it's great to see that being recycled as well. So it's using what we've got and the implication of what we're doing much more thoughtfully is probably the word for that, and again, taking that into your decision-making process.
Well, I think that distributed network and building, I suppose, the market at that scale where it can be well distributed is essential to any sort of balancing. And as TU Dublin is one of the biggest consumers of the Tala waste heat sustainable energy community out there, these community-based models where you're actually networked in, and it goes back to your point, Matt, about partnership. You can't do it alone. I think there's a whole range of new partnership models that we see emerging, and it speaks to entrepreneurial instincts, and it also speaks to high-level government policy in terms of having a whole of country or whole of EU approach to how we bring about solutions to a challenge that's for everybody, ultimately. I'm conscious of time, and I'm going to move on to a question about policy. And actually, Lorraine, you mentioned this before in terms of the rapid in recent years, given the challenges we have, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive from the EU that is coming to pass and will hit all organizations in 2024. And just that need, going back to Matt, about how do we do this? How do we measure this? But the need around data in order to do that, and to do that with integrity. Because there is an issue about integrity and brand, and I suppose the core purpose of the businesses that we're part of. So I suppose my question is, what, from your perspective, in your group, are some of the key legislative policies that will, or you're preparing for, that will impact your business going forward?
I think CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is probably the big one at the moment, along with the EU taxonomy. So I suppose on the EU taxonomy, we're seeing it from both angles in terms of a corporate reporting requirement, but also, an institutional buyer requirement where they're looking at particular assets and they're looking to see how can they be aligned to taxonomy. So that's certainly driving action. the CSRD is really a fundamental change. And if you look at what the EU wants to do, they want sustainability information to be at the same level as financial information. Now, the financial community have had a long time to kind of get there. We're doing it in a very short amount of time. And it's a fundamental change, you know, and we've had talks internally. If you ask people for financial information, you know, you usually get it quite rapidly. This is a really different, I suppose, approach for people, and people are not used to collecting that amount of data. Our supply chain are not necessarily used to giving us that amount of data. And in some cases, we're still trying to figure out what is the data that we actually want. So I think everybody is grappling with it. But I suppose the result it's having is, if you need to report it, then you need to be doing it. So if you step back from that, you need to have the policies. You need to actually be measuring the impact you're having. You need to have an action plan in place so that you can report all of these things. So it's certainly driving action, and it's driving action all along the value chain, and that's a really good thing. I think, you know, nobody's going to be perfect when we kind of go live with the first ones, and that's okay, because it's more about, okay, we're getting there, this is the plan to how to do it. So it's about setting out those plans, and it's about bringing everybody, you know, with you on the journey, including all of those suppliers that, you know, will need to give us that information. So it's a really interesting time, I think, in the world of corporate sustainability, because I think there's going to be huge changes, and it's come at such a rapid pace. You know, I think everybody thought around the start of COVID, is this going to stall a little bit?
Yeah.
And it actually went the other way, you know.
It did.
So it's full steam ahead.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is seeing how businesses are responding to that reporting requirement, because it brings about all sorts of really core issues around transparency and sharing and collaboration. And in the public sector, where the universities sit, we are large public sector bodies, and we fall under the public sector climate action mandate. So we too are going through our first iterations of transparent reporting around what are we doing for our climate action roadmaps. And that process is hard, and it is about bringing people with you. And there is, I suppose, a bit of empathy and tolerance for it's not going to be perfect. And it's not going to be perfect because the environment around us is changing so rapidly all the time. And this is a big culture shift for a lot of people as well. So I think it'll be interesting to watch the space between public bodies and private companies actually start to mirror one another in many ways where they haven't previously in the past decades. So, Matt, over to you. Policy that's impacting.
Yeah, so it's been a very rich 5 years for policy. It's like we've been waiting for 15 years without policy, and then all the buses come together. What I found, certainly the reporting directive is going to be a big deal for every business that operates within the European Union. I also find that the recasting of the Performance and Buildings Directive, the integration of more whole life carbon into our design requirements and our building regulations, that's going to be a big change. But rather than maybe talk about and of course internationally or European level, this week the science-based targets for nature came out, and we have the EU taxonomy for the environment. We're having the EU taxonomy for nature next year. So it's all coming thick and fast, and it's very confusing in the market. There's very little direction. What I would consider what is really keeping people awake at night at the moment in Ireland is the Climate Action Plan. And my main take on the Climate Action Plan is, okay, there's clear direction in terms of targets, but there's not clear direction in terms of implementation. And I have a tendency to move back away from reporting. We've no challenge with reporting if you're doing the right things. But if you're not implementing, you have nothing to report. So let's talk a little bit about action there. And there's a lot of confusion in the market about what action needs to happen. But the real concern that I have is linking a little into what Tom was talking about in terms of the work with Fáilte Ireland and Just Transition. How are these policies going to be fair? So how does a future, say for example the sectoral budgets being implemented, being driven through government in terms of decarbonisation of something like transport.
Yeah.
How is that going to be fair on someone who lives in the Midlands and travels twice a day to Dublin? Are they the ones that are going to be really impacted? And how do you ensure that that policy is equitable and fair and just? And whether that's around the built environment or transportation, or regardless of what side of the policy is, how do you ensure that the user, that the initiative, the policies are implemented in a very fair and clear way? Now, that is unclear at the moment, but I would tend to say now the policies are there and we have targets, but like, where is the guidance coming to local authorities, for example?
Totally.
And if you translate, say, for example, a 51% emissions reduction in a city like, say, Galway, and they want to have a sectoral target in terms of transportation, land use, and buildings, and all of these different sectors, what do the measures look like to get you there?
Yeah.
And that's really unknown at the moment. And in fact, they're not palpable, they're not feasible when you break down the 51% in terms of what needs, the change that needs to happen, and that's where guidance is required.
Absolutely. I mean, we did the cost estimate to get TU Dublin to 2030 in terms of just our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we could get to near zero for 600 million, and we don't have that money. And if you scale that up, the question of implementation becomes kind of, you disengage because there is no path, as you say. I think, one of the key things is these ideas of, and it was great to see in the Climate Action Plan in December, the Midlands with a really long section which gives that scene setting to the challenges, I think, to tee us up to a much different place around distribution models. And so in TU Dublin, for example, our Scope 1 and 2 emissions play a factor of about 22% of our footprint. Our travel and commuting and our purchasing, our Scope 3 is the majority, yet that's not what we're asked to report on yet. We will in future, but that's where I think, the influencing and behavior change piece with people to reduce down where you can, where it's actually possible, and then to think differently about how you're contributing back. And so we're looking at the skills piece in terms of the construction industry and how we can contribute back to test some of those distribution models in terms of the impact that we will have over time and may not hit those targets. So would you like to talk a little bit about policy? I'm conscious of the time here as well.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I will be quick. But I guess it's just the rider for this in the policy environment is that policy traditionally was quite a slow-moving train, much to what Matt's comment was on. There's a quote that a friend of mine often says: "We're the first generation to understand what the climate emergency is, and we're the last one to be able to do anything about it before it all goes horribly wrong."
It's all happening.
So that really brings it into sharp focus for legislators, for policymakers, whether you're at a European, national or local government level. Everybody has to be thinking about this. Consumers in their home, everything. All of our decisions should be having that sort of lens that we look at. We can't afford for future generations not to consider it that way. And I guess just building on the comments that have been made by Lorraine and Matt, I guess one of the other areas that we're quite keen to ensure from an Amazon perspective is that we continue to afford the opportunity for corporates to play a part in all of that. As we've talked about, data is a big thing. We want our data to be as clean as possible. We want our data to be backed by sustainable sources. So we need PPA markets. We need to have the ability to access that capacity that is clean as grids are still going through that transition. So I think it's been helpful to see that that's been recognised at a European level, and that all forms of clean energy that are sponsored through a PPA or through some sort of participation by a business, the kudos for that is effectively come back so that they can then report on that and ensure that transparency piece is there. I guess the other piece from a policy perspective is to make sure that there's adequate transparency around grid planning, and that's taken. That's going to require a bit of a change of mindset. There might need to be some anticipatory investment made so that we can enable that change all the faster. If we wait until something is known and certain and definite, it might be too late. Yeah. So we have to make sure that we've got that kind of opportunity captured in our brain about what that future is going to look like, and take brave steps now. All of us have to take brave steps now to reach that future and achieve the targets that have been set.
And I think that agility piece and that kind of forecasting piece requires us to be on the same page and to all actually be signed up to commit to this. And I think there is an awakening, and it is this kind of burst of activity between legislation coming down at us and people actually feeling the effects globally. But I think that, for me, is the main purpose, and it drives what we do, and it drives our impact as people on the world for the future. So I'm just going to ask to wrap up briefly with imagine the future, 50 years fast forwarded. And what does it look and feel like in 3 words? And Lorraine, we kick us off.
I think it'll be connected. I think it'll be, I suppose, collaborative. And I guess smart. That's my hope anyway.
Excellent, excellent. Matt?
Yeah, I could give you a very stereotypical, inclusive, sustainable systems, but I think at the moment everyone is focusing on what the IPC say about the consequences of inaction.
Yeah.
And I would like to think in 2050 we can just stand up and say, these are the consequences of action. This is what has happened because we did this action over the last 30 years to be able to deliver a world. So consequences of action.
Nice.
I guess for me, and not to steal words from Lorraine as well, but again, very smart, very connected, and absolutely future-proofed so that we don't end up back here again.
Resilient and learned. Excellent. Well, thank you so much to all of you for being here and for sharing with the audience today.
Thank you.